The father was not a man of many words. His neighbors often said he carried a quiet strength, the kind that does not announce itself yet steadies the air around it. I first noticed it in small scenes that most people would let slip by, like a leaf drifting over a slow river. On winter mornings he would step outside before dawn, the world still bluish and thin with cold, and clear the steps of the house next door, because their owner worked nights and slept through sunrise. He never knocked to be thanked. He simply left a clean path where there had been ice. He fixed the hinge on the old widow's gate and left a small jar of oil on her porch with a scrap of cloth to remind her she could keep it moving. He stayed late at the community garden to haul soil for a plot that was not his. He kept jumper cables in the trunk and a folded blanket in case someone needed warmth more than words. Each action was a single note, but together they formed a quiet hymn that seemed to rise from him without effort. At home he moved the same way, gentle and unhurried. He wiped the table until it shone, not because anyone asked, but because care, to him, was a way of speaking. When a neighbor's boy scuffed our fence with his bike, the father sanded the mark smooth and taught me how to paint with even strokes. He said nothing about blame. The afternoon sun slid down the boards, and in its soft gleam I learned that repair is a kind of welcome. There were days when his kindness looked like heavy lifting. A storm once tossed branches across 3 yards, and by evening he had filled 6 bags and stacked them by the curb. He came in with mud on his jeans and a tired smile that held a small brightness, like a lamp turned low so as not to wake a sleeping house. On those evenings, the rooms felt warmer. Nothing grand had changed, yet everything felt tended. People sometimes mistook his quiet for distance. They did not see how he stood a little longer when someone spoke, giving space for their worry to settle. They did not notice how he kept an extra nail in his pocket for a neighbor's loose step. I noticed, though, the weight of his example pressed softly on the dais, shaping them the way a river shapes stone. Not through force, but through constancy. I did not yet know it, but the ground beneath my life was being laid, one small kindness at a time, each as light as a petal, and just as capable of changing the season. Children have a way of noticing what adults think goes unseen. At first I only caught fragments of his quiet service. I would peer out the window and see him bent under the weight of a branch, or returning late with sleeves damp from rain, or standing at the curb with a neighbor whose voice trembled like a loose wire. The pieces did not make a picture yet. They floated like scattered seeds, and I did not know what would grow from them. School sharpened my hunger to be seen, to belong, to be impressive in ways that could be counted. Trophies lined other people's shelves. Laughter clustered where the boldest stories were told. My father's kind of glory did not translate there. He missed a game once because a neighbor's basement filled with water. The team photo came out without him on the sideline. A thin sadness ran through me like a hairline crack in glass. I did not say anything at dinner. He washed the dishes as if polishing the day, and I kept my eyes on the fork in my hand, as though it were responsible for the ache. Another time, I heard a careless remark from a man across the street who said the father liked to look good by helping. The words felt like gravel kicked against a window. I watched my father wave from the driveway and carry on with his tasks. No defense, no explanation, only a steady kindness that did not change shape under pressure. I wanted to storm across the street and rattle the truth into the man's pockets. Instead, I carried the heaviness to my room and set it down beside my books like a shadow. Yet noticing has its own slow heat. One afternoon I followed the father to the community garden. He stooped to pull weeds from a path that no one claimed. The sun lay low on his shoulders. He paused to release a ladybug from a tangle of dry grass, and the tiny red dot lifted into the air as if a burden had been cancelled. The moment was small enough to miss, but it loosened something in me. Care was not a performance. Care was a posture that shaped the body from the inside. That week I began to test the shape. I returned a library book for a classmate who kept forgetting. I stayed after practice to stack cones. No one clapped. The quiet felt strange at first, like walking without a jacket into a gentle wind, but the air carried warmth of its own. The dip I had carried started to thin, not because the world noticed, but because I was noticing differently. The seeds began to root. I could feel the ground of his example under my feet, steady as a hand at the small of the back, guiding me forward without a word. The years moved forward, and with them, the father's quiet rhythm never changed. By the time I was grown, his hair had thinned into silver threads, and his steps slowed just enough to make me want to walk beside him. Yet his hands still carried that same willingness, always ready to lift, mend, or steady. What struck me most was that he never seemed to expect repayment. His giving was like a well that never asked for coins, only to be drawn from so others could drink. When I left for college, I carried more than books and new clothes. I carried the memory of him shoveling snow in the dark, fixing fences without being asked, offering his presence without fanfare. In the crowded, restless halls of campus, his example followed me. One evening, a girl from my class struggled with groceries on a steep flight of stairs. I hesitated only for a second before taking the bags from her arms. Her startled smile felt familiar, as though I had seen it before on neighbors' faces. It was then I realized I was walking in his footprints without thinking. Years later, my own children began to grow. I saw in their eyes the same hunger for recognition I once carried, the same tug of wanting to be noticed. I worried sometimes that the noise of the world would drown out the quiet lessons I had inherited. But one evening, I watched my daughter pause on her walk home to tie a loose shoelace for a younger child. Another day, my son carried water across a field to an older man trimming hedges under the heat. These were small gestures, almost invisible to others, yet they shone to me like lanterns in the dusk. The cycle had turned, not with speeches or instructions, but with presence, with example. The father's hands had shaped mine, and now my children's were being shaped in turn. What began as a quiet act in one yard spilled into another, then another, like ripples moving out from a single stone dropped into a still pond. His life had been a lesson, not written in books or spoken in heavy words, but lived in the everyday moments most people might overlook. In that realization, I felt something open inside me, a warmth that was both gratitude and resolve. His kindness had outlived his strength, carried forward through us. The world may never call his name, but his influence walked quietly in many places, like light moving from one candle to another, never diminished. That is the power of example, the silent teaching that outlasts time itself. Sometimes, the greatest legacies are not carved into stone or spoken into crowds. They are the habits of the heart, passed gently from hand to hand, from one generation to the next. The Father's life reminds us that our truest teachings are written in what we do, not what we say. And perhaps the deepest measure of a life is not how loudly we are remembered, but how quietly we continue to shape the lives that follow. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on your own example. Share this with someone who inspires you, and let's keep the light of kindness moving forward. For more stories like this, remember to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel.